Thank you. And now may I request Professor Chaturvedi, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these very, very kind words of introduction. This is very humbling indeed. I feel deeply honored by this invitation, and I'm very grateful to Yashwantrao Chauhan Research Center in Social Sciences. I am truly indebted to Honorable Member of Parliament, Srimati Supriya Suleji. And I'm also very thankful to all of you for taking out time this afternoon. I know it's a working day to, take out time out of your busy schedules and giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you. Let us try to make it a dialogue, because I think we sometimes hear too many monologues, and as somebody who has been deeply interested in climate change, questions of environmental sustainability, I do fear that there is a risk. These are all words that you hear in climate change vocabulary. There's a risk of climate change conversations becoming monologues. And I hope that in the audience today we have diverse disciplines being represented. We also have distinguished colleagues from media, so that we can generate a dialogue. Also in the hope that this dialogue will lead to dialogic politics on climate change, about climate change. Later this afternoon, when I was sort of doing my homework for this conversation, I was of course reminded of the vision of Shri Yashwantrao Chauhan, his conversations with Pandit Nehru, and I was also reminded of what Nehruji said about universities. And I think what he said about a university is very much applicable to any center of learning, be it very initial schooling or advanced research centers. And he said, quote, "A university stands for humanism, for tolerance, for reason, for adventure of ideas, and the search for truth." Now, I think these words by Pandit Nehru are also very, very relevant in our conversations on climate change, and I will try to illustrate that point in my presentation to the best, to my best of my ability. Now, you will see that in the title, climate terror comes first. So the first part of my presentation will be about climate terror. By the way, this happens to be the title of a book that I wrote in 2015 with somebody whom I have always admired and I have learned a great deal from, Professor Timothy Doyle. It was called Climate Terror, a Critical Geopolitics of Climate Change. So I've taken that liberty, and I would like to very much acknowledge the fact that a lot that I'm going to share with you this afternoon is the result of a collaborative research work. So my intellectual debt to him and to several colleagues. Global South, because I honestly feel, and I hope you will agree with me, I'll try to convince you on that locations matter. I don't think there is anything called flat world yet. I have just returned from Israel, and I think that also sort of makes me underline this point that we do live in a world of very complex political, social, and cultural geographies, and whether we are located in global north or global south, or whether we are located in coastal regions, in coastal cities, or in the hinterland of Maharashtra, whether we live in urban settings or agrarian settings, it does matter. Locations do matter, and they should matter. Because if we do not acknowledge the locations, we will not be able to generate a dialogue. And then you will see that I'm going to talk about a very intriguing intersection of science. And I'm still under the spell of my association with Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The 6th assessment report is with all of you. I am reminded of the conversations that we have had over the last 4 years at, again, diverse locations: Durban, Kathmandu, Lisbon, and the 4th location we could not reach in Latin America because the pandemics came in with its own messages. Ethics, because sometimes we get so much swayed away by the call of geopolitics, and particularly excessive geopolitics, too much of geopolitics, that we forget about humanism. You know, I made a reference to that earlier when I was quoting Nehruji. Ethics and then geopolitics. There's no getting away. There's no getting around geopolitics. But one way of addressing the excess of geopolitics, as you will see in the case of climate change, is to take up certain normative positions, to take up certain ethical positions. So climate terror. How do we define climate terror? We are flooded, metaphorically, this is also a reality, we are flooded with images, we are flooded with numbers: 1.5 degrees warming, 2.2 degrees warming, and much feared but still anticipated 4 degrees warming by the end of the century. We have multiple texts and narratives, and I will share some of these slides with you. Why does the fear of climate become so terrorizing? A number of reasons for that. First is that climate change is incremental, and even when you feel it, you do not see it. And yet there is a politics of embodiment. The abstract is being embodied. Polar bears, to give you just one example, in the Arctic. So incremental climate change creates all kinds of cartographic anxieties. And let us not forget that when you talk about the terms like global risk society, Ulrich Beck's concept, the threats of the Cold War era were rather territorialized, and they still are. For example, nuclear weapons, they have a location. But now we see that we have moved into gradually what is called the Anthropocene, from Holocene to Anthropocene, where all these threats are getting increasingly territorialized, right? Deterritorialized. And there is this process of deterritorialization. There is also a process of re-territorialization. That means that the abstract climate change, as you will see in the course of my presentation, is also getting embodied. The second is the slow, gradual disappearance of hope from climate narratives. Fear has taken over, as I will argue. And what also creates more fear about climate change is the fact that we live in an era of non-politics and non-political. Technopolitics, technocracy seems to be taking over, when we are being told that, don't worry, solutions will come. They might come from military, they might come from market, they might come from market-military nexus. This is not to suggest that market has no role to play. Public-private partnerships have no role to play. This is not to suggest that traditional conventional security agencies don't have much to do with climate change. Of course, they have a very important role to play. But the point is that when politics disappears, hope also disappears. Fear takes over, because then you feel that your destiny, your future is not in your hands. So this politics of the non-political. Remember that when we were talking about sustainability debates, and we still are grappling with the challenge of sustainable development goals, there was a politics. The politics was who pollutes more, who pollutes less. And there was this something called polluter pays principle. But in case of climate change, as you will see, who pollutes more? The atmosphere, the new strategic space, and who pollutes less is not very easy to decide. So that's another reason. And other reasons will follow in the form of these graphics. I still remember the morning when I was in Mumbai on that day, when suddenly you find dead fishes appearing on the beaches of Mumbai. I was wondering whether it is because of climate change or it is because of the land-based pollution. What's going on? Because the same thing was happening elsewhere. Things were happening in Bengaluru, things were happening off the coast of Goa. Something was going on. And we are being told, based on very solid scientific evidence, that all is not well with the ocean health. There might be more plastic, as you will see later, in the ocean than there would be fish. So you certainly have an intersection here, which is the intersection of the Anthropocene, where something has gone wrong with us, with humanity, with our societies, with our understandings of what development is all about. Ecological irrationalities stand deeply entrenched. I will illustrate this point later. Then there are these imaginative geographies of future catastrophe, climate threat, climate danger, and climate wars. Now, when you use metaphors like war for climate change, for global warming, sometimes we forget that wars create exceptions. Exceptions take over. And sometimes exceptions become the norm, about which we should be very, very careful. Self-fulfilling prophecies happen. We do not know whether there is something called clash of civilizations. At least I don't believe in it, of Huntington's thesis, but the fear, well-founded fear perhaps, is that all these narratives can become very self-fulfilling. So we have Dyer, for example, telling us, and see, 2025, and we are here in Global South, we are here in Mumbai, we are here in South Asia. He says, and when Cyclone Anwar struck in 2025 and killed at least 2 million, a lot of people in the rich world simply wondered why the stupid Bangladeshis insisted on living in such a dangerous place, as if there were lots of unoccupied lands elsewhere for them to move to. Shameful behavior, of course, but also quite human, unquote. I have been working on Antarctica for more than 2.5 decades now. But I have looked at Antarctica as a social scientist. The more I have worked in the Antarctic domain, the more I have realized the importance of the intersection between natural sciences and social sciences. A very important SCAR report, this is science, based on ice core drilling, solid scientific evidence that we have. Future fate of Antarctica's ice sheet is one of the largest uncertainties in climate science. And climate science is still full of uncertainties. Up to this point, science. The second part of it can be very fear-inducing, particularly for all of you here in Mumbai. Because if this were to happen, about 2 meters of global sea level rise is locked up in the highly vulnerable parts of the Antarctic ice sheet, and it is already beginning to melt. So this is one of the satellite images of the Larsen C iceberg. On an average, it will be about 625 feet thick, but could dip as far as 690 feet below the water's surface. And this, believe me, is the tip of the iceberg. 3 million years ago, we are told, on the basis of this ice core drilling, Earth had 400 ppm carbon dioxide. Antarctica melted, contributing 13 to 15 meters to global sea level rise. So imagine the cryosphere, melting cryosphere. Antarctica ice, Arctic, the Himalayan glaciers, and you have something to really worry about, if not fear about. Arctic sea ice. Arctic is warming twice at the global average. Science. Geopolitics. Arctic is being seen as in change. There is an Arctic paradox. The fossil fuels, which are responsible for global warming, are becoming one of the major attractions of what is called the opening up of the Arctic. Another gulf is supposed to be there in the continental shelves, particularly off Russia, of the coast of Russia, in the Arctic Ocean. So the Arctic ice has retreated, has thinned, but we can't stop here. This is science, fear follows. The permafrost pandemic could be the melting Arctic release a deadly disease. So sometimes, when we talk about the pandemic, we celebrate the fact that we are no longer wearing the masks. And my submission is that perhaps we have not learned the lessons from the pandemic. We have just looked at it as a pandemic. We have not realized that pandemic is the outcome of the reckless destruction of nature and the habitat of not just the humans but all living species on Earth. If that is the case, then next pandemic may come from melting glaciers, and this is new scientific data that is telling us. Could ancient viruses from melting permafrost cause the next pandemic? So this is also feeding into what we call climate fear, multiplied manifold, resulting in some kind of a climate terror. When you feel the heat at your location, you suddenly realize whether it is urban floods in Mumbai or it is the new fire zones in Australia or it is the Arctic conditions up north in North America, when you feel it, you realize that you are really faced with exposures. So this is another example inside Australia's climate emergency, the new fire zone. Coastal flooding, 2100. This is how Chittagong is going to look like. So as you will see later, Bangladesh is being increasingly framed as the climate change black hole. This has implications. Syria's war preceded by drought. 1.5 million rural Syrians migrated to the cities. Climate change made the migrate 2 to 3 times more likely. Now, what is going on here is not easy to tell. How much of it is because of climate change? How much of it is because of non-climatic factors? We do not know. But as somebody who was deeply engaged with the IPCC process, if you read the IPCC 6th assessment report, you will see that there is a lot more to the numbers that we are talking about. 1.5, 2 degrees, 10 million, 15 million, 20 millions, 50 millions. And that is a very rich, nuanced text to which I will refer a little later. But the point is that international organizations, think tanks, media, we are all coming out with these stories where climate change is being projected as the culprit. So making climate more fear-inducing. It is not that it is not a part of reality. It is there. If you look at the ocean, for example, from decline to recovery, we are looking at a very serious problem of IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. Geopolitically, what adds to this fear is the fact that China today has one of the largest IUU fishing fleets in the world. So the things don't stop here. They also become a very complex, serious geopolitical issue. The high seas are facing a cycle of declining ecosystems, health and productivity, and we are told that it is our joint responsibility to act urgently and decisively to reverse the decline of the immense global commons. Failure to do so would be an unforgivable betrayal of current and future generations. There is a point here. When we worry about climate change, when we fear climate change, when we get terrorized by climate change, we normally are imagining ourselves in the territorial trap. We are within state containers. We are within our social containers. But what about the global commons? What about those spaces which are beyond the spaces of national maritime jurisdiction? And we don't realize that we are living on a blue planet. So what happens in one part of the ocean, whether it is the plastic, dumping of plastic, or it is the dumping of untreated urban sewage off the coast of, say, Mumbai, for example, will not stop at any boundary. It will travel to different parts of the world ocean. Plastics, as we know, are a major source of pollution on the high seas and a great threat. And scientists are quite right in reminding us that there might be more plastic in the ocean than fish. Now this calls for, it's a huge challenge, this calls for not only individual behavioral change, which is important, but it is also calls for a collective behavioral change. And as a philosopher, I'm reminded of Zizek, for example, who said once that when you talk about changing behavior in the context of, say, global north, it could even be the end of a lifestyle. It could be the end of our way of living, our way of a more civilized living. So it's not easy to convince people in the United States, for example, to drive their cars on the joint lane, pool lane, as it is called. Another point which I want to flag before you is that why climate is becoming so fearful is because it is unfolding in a climate of fear. Climate is not the only thing that is changing in the world. And climate is also, and there are things which are not changing enough. I will come to that point a little later. But let's take a look at the climate of fear. And what is fear? Why should we address fear? Fear has become an environment from which the subject of hope perhaps simply appears out of place. It has become replaced by an obsession with levels of alarm and emergency. The management of how much we are to be scared. It becomes a state of war with no ends. You will agree with me that right from the morning till we go to our beds, most of our exposure is to the geographies and cartographies of fear. There are fear-inducing mass media channels. There are fear-inducing stories. So we do live in an environment which is dominated by politics of fear. As a result, the practices of hope simply disappear. It's a big challenge. This is your COVID wake-up call. It is 100 seconds to midnight. What is going on here? It is one of the most respected scientific magazines, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And this bulletin has a clock called Doomsday Clock, which keeps on shifting. Nuclear weapon threats is one. Fear of nuclear weapons, very legitimate. Chemical weapons, another fear. Now climate change has been added to the list. And it says, I quote, governments have also failed to sufficiently address climate change. A pandemic-related economic slowdown temporarily reduced the carbon dioxide emissions that cause global warming. But over the coming decade, fossil fuel use needs to decline precipitously if the worst effects of climate change are to be avoided. Instead, fossil fuel development and production are projected to increase. Atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations hit a record high in 2020, one of the two warmest years on record. The massive wildfires and catastrophic cyclones of 2020 are illustrations of the major devastation that will only increase if governments do not significantly and quickly amplify their efforts to bring greenhouse gas emissions essentially to zero, unquote. Where should we look for hope? Civil society, non-governmental organizations, non-state actors? I would rather like to believe. Now, when you hear scientists using these metaphors, you really wonder what is it that they are trying to achieve. Are they adding to our fear? or they are trying to sort of convince us that don't fiddle when the Rome is burning. Things are getting, out of control. Things are really getting from bad to worse, and the window is closing very fast. So please do something about it. Please remember, scientists are scientists, and that is the reason that we need partnerships between scientists and social scientists. Right? And that is really one of my central messages to generate further dialogue on this, that how do we get out of the silos of our disciplines and our domains and our professional responsibilities and create a movement based on the recognition that both unfounded fear and ill-founded hope can be equally harmful. As one of my friends, critical geographers, Matthew Spark, has been telling us for a long time, that you run a risk with both. But first of all, let's look at the language and the metaphors. Maybe a sense of desperation. Sir John Houghton says, the impact of global warming are such that I have no hesitation in describing it as a weapon of mass destruction. Weapon of mass destruction. So you have created an intersection of nuclear weapons and the threat of climate change. Stephen Hawking needs no introduction. Terror only kills hundreds of thousands of people. Global warming could kill millions. We should have a war on global warming rather than the war on terror. We are close to the tipping point where global warming becomes irreversible. David King writes in Science, in my view, climate change is the most severe problem that we are facing today, more serious even than the threat of terrorism. Billions of us, numbers. Whether these numbers are more telling or more terrorizing, I leave it to you to decide. But billions of us will die from climate change, and the new and the few breeding pairs of people that will survive will be in the Arctic, where the climate remains tolerable by the end of the 21st century. James Lovelock, who, as you know, recently passed away. Now, mention of Arctic sounds pretty good here, because when we imagine the Arctic and when we imagine Antarctica, sometimes we don't realize that Arctic, unlike Antarctica, is the homeland of First Nations indigenous peoples. There are Inuits, there are Samis, and the way in which permafrost is melting, the way in which the infrastructure in the Arctic is being threatened. All these ancient cultures are facing an unprecedented threat and danger. Arctic is opening up. You're talking about the Northern Sea route. You're talking about the oil and gas exploration. So a very complex landscape is unfolding there. Climate science is telling us that climate change acknowledges no borders, and we have seen that in the case of pandemic. And yet we see borders. We see climate borders. How? Now this map will look fairly innocent to you, right? In some ways it is an innocent cartography. It is telling us that there are tipping points. We have entered into the era of the Anthropocene. Human beings have become a great geological force, and a new category of boundaries has emerged before us, and that is called the planetary boundaries. And if you push the planetary boundaries too hard, you are at the tipping points. This map is being superimposed on the demographic map. And you can imagine, I want you to imagine, I'm addressing my young friends here, to imagine two kinds of worlds today. If you use the numbers, I call it numerical geopolitics. Majority world and the minority world. Minority world is the global north. Majority world is the global south. Hence, in my title, Perspectives from Global South. Now, when you impose this tipping point map on the demographic map, sometimes demographic dividend is not that visible, but demographic dead weight is being imagined. That, here is this bulge in the global south. And this creates what? This creates what we have also described in a book, Climate Terror, neo-Malthusian fears. Further adding to climate terror, that climate change is taking place in where? In the majority world of global south, where you have the maximum number of poor, the marginalized. This will cause displacements, no doubt about it. It is causing displacements. This is where you have to really, as students of social sciences in particular, you have to very carefully examine, map out what is called climate mobility. In fact, I always use the word IM in bracket before mobility. Not just mobility, but also immobility. And I will show you a few slides from your city, from our city, Mumbai, later on, to underscore this point. Not everybody is able to move. In fact, the serious research that has taken place on climate change tells us that a vast majority of people will not have the capacity to move. Right? They might become sitting ducks of a sort. They might cross regional boundaries. They might go from the rural to the urban. They might go from the hinterland to the coastal areas. If coastal areas become more, difficult to live because of the sea level rise, they might move back into the hinterlands. But we still do not have sufficient evidence to suggest that people will cross international borders because of climate change, or they will become what is another very problematic category called climate refugees. Yet, all these imaginative geographies, these imaginations of future threats, are doing what? They are reinforcing the borders which already exist, and they are creating more borders. To give you just one example of climate change, health implications, pandemics, I just read a book called Medicalization of Borders. I would urge my young friends, scholars, to read that book called Medicalizing Borders. And what is the message of that book? The message of that book is that we live with boundaries of all kinds. These could be the boundaries of class, caste, gender, race, and we have gone through the pandemics. So what happens is that when you look at these moving human bodies, you see the disease in the other. There's a difference between the disease that you carry in your body, and there is a disease that you see being carried in others' bodies. Other bodies become then threatening. So, all these imaginative geographies, and also partly based on the evidences, I'm not saying that there are no displacements, there are no movements. We saw those displacements and movements are leading to what is called securitization of mobility, climate mobility. It is understandable that the conventional understandings and institutions of security, I'm not saying that this is a wrong framing, this is a wrong understanding. It is an incomplete understanding, certainly, but it is also being taken as one of the fallouts of climate change, implications of climate change, that there will be new unstable zones, right? There would be more recruitments into these terrorist organizations, and there would be opportunities for humanitarian interventions in those parts of the world where climate anarchy is unfolding. So that is another reality that we have to reckon with, all these scenario building exercises. So what sometimes happens is that the numbers that come from science, climate science, they travel to different sites and they are translated in different ways, further leading to new kinds and categories of borders. Another example, preventing the world's next refugee crisis, famine, conflicts, and climate change in Nigeria, Sudan, Somalia, Yemen. A critical perspective from Global South will remind you of the colonial chapters, will remind you of the colonial past. It will also remind you that Anthropocene is also Capitalocene. I'll come to that slide a little later. But see, when you frame climate change as a threat to national security, then you are looking at the whole of Africa. This is a very sort of telling graphics in front of you based on a CA Corporation report, National Security and the Threat of Climate Change, that climate change will facilitate weakened governance, economic collapse, human migrations, potential conflicts. Stability, operations, and humanitarian emissions could increase for the United States of America. So this is another framing, you know. Climate change, Bangladesh being seen as a climate change black hole, because given its low-lying island geography. It doesn't stop here. The framing doesn't stop here. It also gets internalized. For example, you have Mr. Atiq Rahman, Executive Director of Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies, says, I quote, "This is the ground zero of global warming. There is no question that this is being caused primarily by human action. This is very outside natural variation. If you really want people in the West to understand the effect they are having here, it is simple. From now on, we need to have a system where for every 10,000 tons of carbon you emit, you have to take a Bangladeshi family to live with you. It is your responsibility." Now look at this narrative from the global north. Is it not fear-inducing? And then there is a research, and it's good that you have this kind of a research, which is telling you that all these messages wrapped up in fear language are not working. Even if they are well-intentional, they are not working. They are not leading to a collective behavioral change. So what is needed, what is required, I don't have full answers. I don't have complete answers. But it says, dire or emotionally charged warnings about the consequences of global warming can backfire if presented too negatively, making people less amenable to reducing their carbon footprint. So fear is not working. Will hope work? I will leave you with that question. But one thing is there, you like it or not. There is a graphic and growing evidence from climate science, IPCC in particular, that things are getting out of control. Things are demanding our immediate and urgent attention. I was one of these scientists and social scientists from different parts of the world. 4 years of very rigorous exercise, as I said, diverse locations being represented. And sometimes, you know, I'm emphatically pointing this out to my students and colleagues in various conversations that please do not divorce these numbers of IPCC from their contexts. So it is important to read the whole report. If not, you can't read the whole report. Then the particular chapter 10 on Asia, for example, if you're working on Asia, please go through the text of the IPCC. Don't divorce the numbers. Because the moment you detach these numbers from this very rich, nuanced context and text of the IPCC, in which we engaged for 4 years, for example, engaged in all kinds of conversations from different disciplines, you do not do justice. You do a lot of injustice to the work, rich work that IPCC has done. And then what happens is that the same numbers then, detached from the IPCC context, can be used for all kinds of scenario building exercises, even if you think that those scenario exercises, building exercises, are going to save us from the threats or the danger. So IPCC is clearly telling you, with every additional amount of global warming, changes get larger. Extreme heat, heavy rainfall, drought, fire weather, ocean warming, losing oxygen, for example. Dead oceans is a fact. Unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade will be beyond reach. So the report, IPCC's report 1.5, is reminding us, telling us that if we exceed that threshold, we are in for a deep trouble. And if we look at the patterns of energy consumption, International Energy Commission, for example, or committee reports, they are telling us that we do not see any noticeable change in the carbon mix, for example. We do not see that shift taking place yet. Despite the promises that we have, despite the visions that we have, including the one in India, we do not see that madly needed paradigm shift yet. So 1.5, a lot of scholars are saying, will perhaps be increasingly in the realm of difficulty, if not impossibility. It says, and I quote just a few of them, particularly with regard to the coasts. Coasts are where ocean and land processes interact, Mumbai, and includes coastal cities, deltas, estuaries, and other coastal ecosystems such as mangrove forests. It will be useful to see how many mangrove forests we are left with in and around Mumbai, or even for the entire country. Low elevation coastal zones less than 10 meters above sea level are densely populated and particularly exposed to hazards from the ocean. SLR, that is sea level rise and response, may affect communities and society in ways that are not evenly distributed. This is an important point, which can compound vulnerability and inequity and undermine societal aspirations such as achieving sustainable development goals. Another quote, with some coastal nations, particularly small island states, being confronted with adaptation costs amounting to several percent of GDP in the 21st century, land use planning for climate adaptations can exacerbate socio-spatial inequalities at the local level, and private responses may also contribute to these inequalities. Recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and unprecedented, not in hundreds of years, but in thousands of years. And then it says something of direct relevance to us. There is high evidence, medium agreement, that increased climate variability and extreme events are already driving migration, and medium evidence, medium agreement projecting longer-term climate change will increase migration flows across Asia. Despite methodological disagreement on detection and attribution of climate due to climate change, there is medium confidence that higher warming and associated changes in frequency and intensity of slow onset events such as droughts and sea level rise, and rapid onset events such as cyclones and flooding will increase involuntary displacements in the future, especially under SSP 3 and SSP 4 pathways. In 2019, Bangladesh, China, India, and the Philippines each recorded more than 4 million disaster-induced displacements. In Southeast and East Asia, cyclones, floods, and typhoons triggered internal displacement of 9.6 million people in 2019, almost 30% of total global displacements. Scientific reports, this is a very recent contribution coming from science, and it shows of direct relevance to Mumbai that for the case of no coastal projection or adaptation and the mean RCP 8 scenario, there will be an increase of 48% of the world's land area, 52% of the global population, and 46% of global assets at risk of flooding by the end of the century. A total of 68% of the global coastal areas flooded will be caused by tide and storm events, with 32% due to projected regional sea level rise. And approximately, please note, 600 million people live in low elevation and coastal zones, coastal regions less than 10 meters above mean sea level, which generates approximately $1 trillion of global wealth. Both the environmental and socio-economic impacts associated with episodic coastal flooding can be massive. Now, what are the solutions? Recently, I was told that Maldives, which you would remember before the Copenhagen summit, COP, the entire cabinet of Maldives went under the sea. And the message that had to be conveyed to the international community was that Maldives faces existential threat. Now, imagining, anticipating, fearing that Maldives will disappear, in extreme case scenario, or if you are exceeding these tipping points, the question then would be, where would these people go? When they become, as they are being called, boat people, in which direction they will move? So some of these solutions that have been offered to Maldives are, and I think leadership in Maldives has also been talking about it, is the structural approach. That is, you raise more walls to protect yourself from the sea level rise. But that doesn't take into account the possibility of tsunamis. And I had a research paper, which probably I removed because I was having too many slides, where one of the leading research journal of science, it was being pointed out that we do fear a major earthquake in the Bay of Bengal. So there is this possibility there. So these are the global hotspots, and you can see the Indian Ocean, you can see the Indian coastline very well marked in red there. Another report, come heat or high water, 308 disasters triggered by natural hazards, 97.6 million people affected, and so on. By 2100, 48% of the global population may be exposed to extreme heat, defined as temperatures above 37 degrees centigrade for at least 20 years every year. If we drastically reduce emissions, if we don't, that could reach 74%. Ministry of Earth Sciences, I do not have time to take you through several very rich chapters in this report. The India Ministry of Earth Sciences has also come out with this assessment of climate change over the Indian region report. And it also clearly says, I quote, since the middle of the 20th century, India has witnessed a rise in average temperature, a decrease in monsoon precipitation, a rise in extreme temperatures and rainfall events, droughts and sea levels, and an increase in the intensity of severe cyclones alongside other changes in the monsoon system. When you see Indian scientists working in the Arctic and Antarctica, you don't realize that what happens in the polar regions will have direct implications for our monsoons. And as somebody has very rightly said, the most powerful finance minister for entire monsoon Asia is the monsoons. So I think there is a good deal of truth in it. At the end of the 21st century, steric sea level rise in the northern Indian Ocean is projected to rise by approximately 300 meters relative to the average over 1986-2005 under this particular scenario, with the corresponding projection of the global mean rise being approximately 180 millimeters. So there is a very clear graphic evidence. Now, coming to the ethics, this is what the science is telling us. This is what the geopolitics is all about, the way it is unfolding. What are the ethical dimensions? How can we be faithful to our disciplinary locations and our physical locations, being located in the post-colonial South Asia, for example? One is that I think we have to acknowledge, when we talk about globalization of all kinds, we have to acknowledge that South Asia, and this could be the ground for building up a new regionalism for South Asia, we are an eco-geographical subcontinent. If you take a look at the subcontinent, which is a subcontinent of Asia, right? And by the way, the boundary between Europe and Asia is a cultural boundary. There's no physical boundary. So when you look at South Asia as an eco-geographical region, we have to appreciate whether we are located here in Mumbai or we are located in Chandigarh, in Punjab, where there's a severe water crisis, or any other part of South Asia, we have to acknowledge that, I quote, in an important ecological sense, life on Earth has always been globalized. Our evolution and health as human beings have been dependent from the start on our interactions with the planetary ecosystem. Nevertheless, the anthropocentric forms of globalization have fundamentally changed these ecological interdependencies, making us the dominant global species and creating today what some scientists refer to as a new ecological turned geological era, the Anthropocene. Now, I think one very important task and responsibility that we face as social scientists is that we have to pluralize Anthropocene. And it is easier said than done. It requires critical interventions, a dialogic politics and conversations. And I take this from a very important book by Ian Angus called Fossil Capitalism and the Crisis of the Earth System. I quote, "The combination of unequal wealth and power with the extreme weather and climate change is already having disastrous impacts on the majority of world's people. The line is not only between rich and poor or comfort and poverty, it is between survival and death." That point, in my view, needs to be undertaken. So very rightly pointed out by Simon Lewis that the first step of solving our damaging relationship with our environment is recognizing it. Easier said than done. Why? Because climate change is not only about science, it is also about cultural understanding. So there can be different meanings of what climate change, cultural understandings of what climate change is all about. At the same time, as we have pointed out in a book called Environmental Sustainability from the Himalayas to the Oceans, in which I have a chapter on the Sundarbans, we have raised the question, can billions in the majority world of global south develop, quote unquote, the way millions in the minority world have? The answer is no. As China and India, the two most populous countries, get their acts together to address the common challenge of sustainable, low carbon futures, they simply cannot afford to underplay the gravity of current environmental unsustainability. They can see the writing on the wall. Environmentally unsustainable present can only lead to an unsustainable future, unquote. I am also reminded here of the Chipko movement. I am also here reminded of Sundarlal Bahugunaji. I am reminded of his note of caution that only a good ecology can be good economics. And sometimes I feel that a big elephant in the room has not been fully addressed. And I hope Yashwant Chauhan Center will take up that challenge. And that is to revisit and rethink the very concept of development by raising the question that is climate change more of a problem of development or more of a problem of consumption, production and consumption. And the way in which economic growth-oriented development has caused irreparable damage to the environment or to nature needs to be taken into account. We need a critical geographical understanding here, as Mike Hume says, that we won't understand climate change only by focusing on its physicality. It is important, but you will not have complete understanding. We need to understand the ways in which we talk about climate change, the variety of myths we construct about climate change, and through which we reveal to ourselves that climate change means to us. For example, during the field work for this book, my co-author Timothy Doyle went to Africa, did the field work, which is very important for those of us who are interested in climate change, asked certain questions to the farmer in Sudan about climate change, and he got his answer that experience is also a form of knowledge. Who creates this expertise, who constructs the dominant scientific narrative of climate change may not be wrong, is right. But unless and until that knowledge is related to the experience of everyday political economy of life, it will not make sense to a farmer. It will not make sense to a fisherman. He may not understand the vocabulary of climate change. He may not know what resilience is. He may not know what vulnerability is. But he is having that experience of change, huge, unprecedented change, which needs to be duly noted and recorded. And then something which those who would like to approach climate change from the left of the center, from the Marxian perspective, will find a remarkable insight in John Bellamy Foster's work called Marx's Ecology, the Ecological Rift. And he says, I quote, Marx employed the concept of a rift in the metabolic relation between human beings and the earth to capture the material estrangement of human beings within capitalist society from the natural conditions that formed the basis for their existence. Recognize that this metabolic rift represented a problem of sustainability and observed, he quotes Marx, all creatures have been made into property. The fish in the water, the birds in the air, the plants on the earth. So this, I think, is a remarkable insight that we see. Richard Grove, who wrote this brilliant book called Green Imperialism, adds another very important ethical dimension to our conversations and dialogue on climate change. And he says, I quote, modern environmentalism, rather than being exclusively a product of European or North American predicaments and philosophies, emerged as a direct response to the destructive social and ecological conditions of colonial rule. Its colonial advocates and their texts were deeply influenced by a growing European consciousness of natural processes in the tropics and by a distinctive awareness of non-European epistemologies of nature, unquote. So non-European epistemologies of nature have to be brought into our mainstream conversations on climate change. This is another point which I thought I will highlight. Another ethical intervention tells us that there is no such thing as natural disasters. They are social disasters, given the hierarchies. They can be governmental disasters or disasters with regard to governance. They can be due to excessive concentration of authority in certain institutions. And then this pre-Katrina, post-Katrina, it's a very fascinating article here, chapter here. It says, I'm very tempted to quote, the water and the wind-driven devastation that racked New Orleans and the entire Gulf Coast region during and after the 2005 hurricane season is virtually without parallel in recent US history. A staggering 2 million people were displaced, but of course, the most salient and ongoing story is one of poverty and racism. All those dramatic, pathetic shots on televisions and in the papers showing who the prime victims were, their helplessness, suffering and abandonment. And since Katrina is in fact a shorthand for a set of economic, social and political conditions that characterize most of metropolitan America, what lessons and models does this provide for the nation as a whole, unquote. And I would say, what lesson does it provide for humanity as a whole? And what lesson does it provide for us here in Mumbai? Another ethical dimension is that one has to be very careful with one's language and categories. You know, there are some categories which become larger than human life. It sounds very good to talk about climate refugees. It sounds very good to talk about climate migrations. But we also have to be aware of what White says, and there's a very important warning here that it sounds to all of us, whether we are from media or we are from humanities or social sciences, that talking about the climate-induced migration. And this is one lesson, by the way, that we learned in IPCC. And this IPCC report also stands out because there was a very large number of social scientists like us. And I remember there was hardly any day when they will not have a debate about definitions, for example, in the IPCC, which was a very healthy debate. We would ask some very basic questions. What is vulnerability? How do you define it? What is resilience? I'll come to that. And because we were working on chapter 10 on Asia, we were constantly reminded of the reality back home. We had the opportunity, political opportunity, for inappropriate and ineffective policy responses, which is true. Therefore, the attraction of consensus. We all want consensus, right? But as James Lovelock once wrote in his critique of IPCC, he said, consensus is not the language of scientists. It may be the language for somebody else, but don't try to arrive at a consensus. Don't try to come out with a meta-narrative of climate change. This is the climate story. Don't do that, because it's not going to work. There is the invocation of the present-day Rohingyas, Chakmas, and the future refugee crisis stemming from climate change can be politically loaded, and the potential for political mischief is profound. So let us be very careful when we use these terms and terminologies. Climate is changing, but as I said, climate is not the only thing that is changing. But what about things that are not changing enough? Another ethical intervention. What about map of poverty? What about malnutrition? What about hunger? What about the fact that as the global population grows and incomes rise across the developing world, overall food demand is on course to increase by more than 50% by mid-century, and demand for animal-based foods by nearly 70%. Yet even today, hundreds of millions of people remain undernourished as local agricultural systems fail to provide enough nutritious food, and economic factors prevent equitable distribution of available food. A very important reminder that food security is not nutrition security. And therefore, we will have to sort of broaden and deepen our understanding of what climate change is all about. Now, just very quickly, I'll take you through these another very important dimension, which is the gender dimension, since I'm running out of time. Firstly, because there are no natural disasters, we know. And the second is that women experience a disproportionately amount of suffering, whether it is Indian Ocean tsunami, Hurricane Katrina, or Haiti, or tsunami. And disasters, I quote, are able to perpetuate pre-existing vulnerabilities and entrenched pre-established systems of oppression. Amitav Ghosh, one of my favorites, says something brilliant in his recent work, in his recent book. And this is where we are looking at intersections. This is where I'm sort of trying to convey to you that given our location, we need to broaden and deepen our understanding of climate change. Climate change is not just global warming. It is global warming plus a number of things. And he says, Amitav Ghosh, it was not till much later that I began to understand that the difference between the migrants' thinking and mine was that for them, climate change was not a thing apart. It was not a moment of rupture. A phenomenon that could be isolated from other aspects of their experience by a set of numbers or dates. Pre-industrial, post-industrial, pre-colonial, 1.5, 2 degrees, 5 million, 10 million. Rather, their experience was formed by sudden and catastrophic intersections of many different factors, of which some were undoubtedly new, like smartphones and changes in the weather. But some other factors were not new at all, being rooted ultimately in the deeply entrenched structures of exploitation and conflict. Viewed from this perspective, climate change is but one aspect of a much broader planetary crisis. It is not the primary cause of dislocations, but rather a cognate phenomenon. In this sense, climate change, mass dislocations, pollution, including air pollution, water pollution, environmental degradation, political breakdown, and the COVID-19 pandemic are all cognate effects of the ever-increasing acceleration of the last 3 decades. Not only are these crises interlinked, they are deeply rooted in history, and they are all ultimately driven by the dynamics of global power. I think it's a remarkable insight here. Now, I can skip these slides. Let me simply come to now the concluding part. Let us talk about our location here in Mumbai. So we have looked at science, we have looked at ethics, we have looked at geopolitics, we have looked at intersections. What does Mumbai hold? What can Mumbai contribute? Should we look at environmentalism of the poor? Should we look at the quest for social, environmental, climate justice? Environmental justice, climate justice are part and parcel of social economic justice. This is what Global South perspectives will tell us, the reality of Global South. Climate change is not a moment of rupture. Climate change is not an isolated story. We should not even begin right only from the pre-industrial. We have to go back to the colonial times. I'll show you a couple of slides about Mumbai itself. So what is environmental justice? Environmental justice, we are told by South African Environmental Justice Networking Forum. This is where civil society voices become so important. Critical voices. Those who are engaged with the field, with the ground, with the earth, with the land, with the question of land. Environmental justice is about social transformation directed towards meeting basic human needs and enhancing our quality of life, economic quality, healthcare, housing, human rights, environmental protection and democracy. In linking environmental and social justice issues, the environmental justice approach seeks to challenge the abuse of power which results in poor people having to suffer the effects of environmental damage caused by the greed of others, unquote. Now we are talking about coastal resilience, right? And my question here is, as I said, what can Mumbai contribute locally, nationally, regionally, and globally as the financial capital of India, one of the fastest growing economies in the world with huge ecological challenges? I have put a question mark before, after, towards a blue urbanism, socio-spatial consciousness and planning. We do talk about spatial planning, but I'm adding socio-spatial, and the reasons are as follows. I will skip this slide, but we are familiar with the narrative of post-disaster by building back better. You have some very useful HIGO framework for action. You have a number of policy recommendations at the global level. We are being told that we need a resilience-based approach. All these are very, very valid arguments. And the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report also defines resilience. Now you know that in climate vocabulary, mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, vulnerability, resilience are very, very important terms. Debatable, they must continue to be debated. It is not that we abandon the concept, but sometimes we have to unload a concept, unload a category, and refill it with our own experiences, with our own knowledge production. And we have to realize that there is no such thing as innocent knowledge production. There are complex geographies behind the production of knowledges. There are compelling reasons which you have to understand as social scientists. Now IPCC, after all these debates between scientists, social scientists, people from Africa, scientists from Asia, Europe, and so on, introduce one thing which I just want to highlight, so I will not read the whole thing, but just the first 4-5 sentences. Resilience in the literature has a wide range of meanings. Adaptation is often organized around resilience as bouncing back and returning to a previous state after a disturbance, right? This is what resilience is. More broadly, the term describes not just the ability to maintain essential function, identity and structure, but also the capacity for transformation. Capacity for transformation. If Mumbai has to become resilient as a coastal city, does Mumbai has the will and the vision to transform itself? Now, why should Mumbai transform itself? Right? What's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong with the geobody of Mumbai? Now, the term geobody has been used for nation. I'm using it for the first time in my narrative for a city. All cities have their geobodies, right? And it is also being called very appropriately by some as Tarascus city. Amitav Ghosh again, in his another book, Great Derangement, puts it beautifully. I mean, this is how he describes Mumbai, right? Our city. An estuarine archipelago with a couple of large hilly islands to the north, close to the mainland, and a cluster of mainly low-lying islands to the south. This being an estuary region, the relationship between land and water was so porous that the topography of the archipelago varied with the tides and the seasons. So if you read his book called the Hungry Tide, on the Sundarbans, he also beautifully describes the coastal Sundarbans and tells us that many of our geographical understandings of what a coast is, what a baseline is, and so on, is not perhaps very right. Coastal, what we call coastal space, has a Janus face, right? It looks both ways. It looks inwards. It is affected by what goes on inland, on land, and it has a face to the ocean. And we have seen it in case of Mumbai, whether it was threat to the security of the city, terrorist attacks, dead fish, land-based sources of pollution. We have been seeing that Janus face. I came across a very fascinating article which I would urge my young friends to really read. I don't think I'll be able to do full justice to it. It's a fascinating article called Making Bombay Island, Land Reclamation and Geographical Conceptions of Bombay from 1661 to 1728. He talks about geopolitical rivalries between Britain and the Portugal, how they sort of imagine Mumbai, the materiality, the engineering that was being done, the colonial engineering that was being done by the British. And then he shows a Murphy map here. This is a Murphy map, 1824, around that time. And he says that the purpose of the Murphy map was to mark out areas of land that were permanently above sea level, thereby identifying distinct islands. In leaving the intervening spaces blank, indistinguishable from the sea, it conceals complex topographical realities. It is easy from this map to say that Bombay was reclaimed from the sea. Such a statement is simplification, however, since the area reclaimed was neither sea nor land, but something in between. By revealing the distinctly early modern motivation of Bombay's land reclamation, we can see how geographical conceptions could be a driving factor in environmental transformation. So my question is, do we need a new geographical conception for Bombay, Mumbai, to realize this environmental transformation towards a resilience which is not just the resilience of the ecosystems, but resilience of people of Mumbai, whether they are in north of Mumbai, they are in the south of Mumbai, or they are the residents of Dharavi. Do we need? Can we do that? Can we reshuffle? Can we respatialize, so to speak, the city of Mumbai? And this is where I came across another very fascinating Tarapus city, where a young, his name is Ryan Tung. You might like to go to his website, and he is an architect, he's a designer, and looking at the Mumbai, he reimagines it. So I think what we need is reimaginations. We need to rethink Mumbai. We have to reinvent the city of Mumbai if we want a resilient Mumbai. For that, we also have to do something else. We have to map the stakes and stakeholders, and we have to ask ourselves, if it is sea level rise, who is at risk? when, where, why, and how. Because we know that the causes and consequences of vulnerability, climate change, for example, are not the same. Not everybody is equally responsible. And not everybody will suffer the same way. The poor and the marginalized will have multiple exposures, like residents of Dharavi, for example. This is where a constructivist perspective will become very important for Mumbai. People of Mumbai, scholars of Mumbai, residents of Mumbai. They will have to pluralize the space place of Mumbai and ask some very hard-hitting questions. And Phil Steinberg is a critical geographer. He says, ocean is perceived and used by various social actors. Each actor might favor certain ocean policies, which in turn would imply further perceptions and constructions of the ocean so as to strengthen their specific interests. If each actor were to pursue its strategy, the result would be a set of social institutions, attitudes, and norms that would reproduce the construction of the ocean as unclaimable transport, surface, claimable resource space, a state of discrete places and events, and a place for military adventure, which will be true for Mumbai's coastal zone, for example. It will require spatial planning, but it would also require what I have said, a socio-spatial transformation. I would just want to highlight this brilliant book, which has just been launched day before yesterday at a conference organized by National Maritime Foundation by Yaudun and Thakur, called Rising Seas and Coastal Impacts, Metropolitan Resilience in India. And they make some very important point, which I thought I'll share with you. I promised them day before yesterday that I will, and I'm keeping that promise. India should rather opt and learn from the new trend, renewal of port city associations. One very practical recommendation, so to speak, addressing the policymakers here, including Metropolitan Authority of Mumbai, to enhance the port city integration, especially in the climate change adaptation strategies. It is also significant to understand the historical role of waterfronts to urban development, the characteristics of present-day waterfronts, and vulnerability of climate change impacts. These are the unique combinations of factors that influence waterfront development. But my key takeaway from this book is that we have to really enhance the port-city integration. And city in all its diversity, which probably has been lost sight of. And that is, I think, is a very, very important point. So to conclude, what I call the inconclusive, it's a quest. I don't have answers, I only have questions. I know that we need to search. What is it? Elusive. Why elusive? Because it is very challenging. It is still eluding us. Scale in circuits. Circulations and cycles of debts, ecological dependencies, old and new. We are looking at vicious cycles and circles. So those who are sitting here from geography discipline, you really have to question the scale, the conventional understanding of scale. Number two, subaltern understanding of planetary crisis unfolding at multiple sites locations, eclipsing indigenous people's experiences and knowledge systems. Number three, climate solidarity in multiple hierarchies of an unequal world. Collective behavioral change through lifestyle changes, for example, which has been made an official policy or a part of the official stance on climate change, which I think is a very useful one. Inclusive adaptive governance, justice, social, ecological, economic, gender in a context dominated by neoliberal capitalism, quest for gender equality in the whirlpool of inequities and inequalities, human livelihood, ontological security in the face of trends that suggest growing militarization and securitization in what is called the neoliberal age. How do we keep climate change desecuritized in the domain of a dialogic politics, in the domain of conversations, will remain a very, very important. This is a very complex phenomena, as you can see, and we have really a lot to cover. In our book, we have said, my last two slides please, climate change is not simply a matter of an abrupt, unprecedented global manifestation of anthropogenic assault on nature in an abstract sense, with undifferentiated geographies and responsibilities of accountability. It is better approached and analyzed as a messy convergence of various strands, paradoxes, and dilemmas that have emanated from the reckless economic growth undertaken by the minority world of the affluent and the influential other. My appeal to all of us here, particularly young students and scholars, is let us join this normative appeal, which was published in a journal called Millennium. Planet politics. This is what the metropolitan Mumbai city demands and deserves. The whole world is looking at Mumbai, and Mumbai is also looking at the whole world. So appeal should go from Mumbai as Mumbai transforms itself. Decolonization is not just renaming of place. It is an important part from Bombay to Mumbai. But we also have to liberate Mumbai from the colonial cartography, from Murphy's map. Reimagine it, respatialize it, make it more resilient in its totality. So I quote, planet politics must emerge as an alternative thought and process, a politics to nurture worlds. This is very important for post-pandemic. A politics to nurture worlds for all humans and species co-living in the biosphere. It now demands a new kind of responsibility, binding environmental justice and social justice inextricably together. Global ecological collapse brings new urgency to the claim that we are all in this together, humans, animals, ecologies, biosphere. To survive, we must ask questions that are intimately connected to capitalism, modernity, and oppression. We must ensure that our diplomacy, our politics, and our institutions are open to those who will bear the brunt of ecological change. This appeal also comes from the people of Dharavi, it comes from North Mumbai, it comes from South Mumbai, and it is very appropriate that G20 Presidency of India has chosen for itself the principle of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. But we need to theorize it, we need to broaden and deepen its meaning. It's not homocentric, human-centric concept. It has to be further broadened to include both the living and the non-living species. And finally, fear is not working, fear will not work. But that does not mean that there is no such thing as well-founded fear. Well-founded fear, ill-founded hope, as I said, are both equally self-defeating. But I'm always very fond of concluding presentations like this, which believe in conversations and dialogues, by quoting Gurudev, Rabindranath Tagore, in his Gitanjali. And that is that, and I think this is in my view, it holds the key to the future of Mumbai and other parts of the India and globe. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert stand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country, and please allow me to insert humanity, awake. So thank you very much for this opportunity and the time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chaturvedi. That was a very engaging lecture, and you've certainly left us with a lot to think about. Thank you. I would now like to call on Dr. Jagannathan to give his share remarks. We can. So what we do normally is we take questions after the chairman's address. Yeah.
I think many thanks for opening up a wide horizon of perspectives which we have to think about and which we have to contemplate about, and the idea firstly about the politics of fear. And I think that's a very powerful message that Professor Chaturvedi is inviting all of us to reflect on. the politics of fear works in multiple paradoxical ways. So therefore, for instance, the idea that the Malthusian fear, the original Malthusian fear, the idea that population is growing and food production is not going to keep pace with population growth, and so therefore we need to do something, and therefore introduces industrial production of agriculture and normalizes industrial mass production of agriculture and so on and so forth, those insertions. In various ways, I believe that there is a paradox that's operating here, which Professor Chaturvedi is inviting us to reflect upon. The paradox is this. Number one, signal the fear of what is likely to happen. The fear of a large number of people dying as a result of famines, as a result of food scarcity, as a result of food grain production not keeping pace with population growth, and so on and so forth, thereby, ironically, normalize the famine that is going to actually follow. And during the world wars or in many other sites, the Bengal famine, for example, the number of people who were killed by the German infliction of terror is almost equivalent to what happened in Bengal during the Second World War at that point of time. So therefore, my apprehension, my anxiety, which is activated by what Professor Chaturvedi is saying over here, that this activation of the discourse or story of climate fear essentially then connects to what he speaks about the hierarchization of citizenship that takes place in the non-politics that's in which we are inserted. And so the idea really is this, that create the sense of climate fear. Paradoxically, therefore, over here, normalize and create consent for the many people who are actually going to die in climate tragedies which are going to occur. The erection of walls, the securitization of borders that's going to emerge over here, create multiple hierarchical levels of citizenship, and so on and so forth. So therefore, it's a very paradoxical, very cunning, very very polymorphous polity that emerges from all these processes. Therefore, how do we counteract fear, and what do we build? And Professor Chaturvedi quoted Zizek over here, perhaps, and also he highlighted the idea of the state of exception, which appears to be emerging in various ways. The state of exception is indeed perhaps already there. The Agambenite, Giorgio Agamben's worldview of the state of exception, where sovereign authority intervenes arbitrarily in the world. No? So therefore, there's a zone of indistinction between what is legal action, what is illegal action. It's a blurred zone. What is ethical action, what is unethical action? Who decides? Sovereign authority decides. No? And sovereign authority decides arbitrarily. And there is a proliferation of sovereign authorities that's emerging in multiple sites of decision making, and so on and so forth. So in contrast then to fear, can we speak about love? Love as a fall. We fall in love, and love is an accident. Love is a contingent way of living and recognizing the vulnerability that comes along with the fall in various ways. And so therefore, in reality, then we speak about science, politics, art, and love, the four truth procedures that the philosopher Alain Badiou leaves us with, and think of many of these as contingent events, as falls which begin to occur, which of course then transgresses the numerical imagination of science, and brings in different embodiments. It also invites us then to think of the epistemology of nature. What do we mean by nature in epistemic terms? And what do we mean by climate in epistemic terms? Is there a universal category called as nature? Is there a universal category called as climate? Of course, meaning there are positivist interventions that may prima facie appear to be helpful. For example, the argument that if there is a greater amount of inequality in society, that leads to climate disasters. and so therefore Gini coefficients and their correlations with climate disasters maybe. And if there is a greater amount of cultural freedom and you're encouraging people with alternative sexualities, multiple languages, and so therefore multiple faiths, and all of them are engaging, maybe a culturally more open society is able to engage with a climate discourse more effectively, is able to build more institutions which have the capacity to deal with the climate crisis that is confronting us more productively. And so therefore, this is the epistemic category of universalization, which operates in the realm of optimality. We build optimal institutions, we build productive institutions, we build institutional capacity. Number one, reduce economic inequality, increase redistribution, and so on and so forth, and maybe expand cultural freedoms of people, and all those things which are emerging in various ways. So therefore, there is this discourse of optimality with which universal categories are able to work. But then the polyvocality of epistemic categories which emerge from accidents, from contingencies, from multiple sites where the idea of love, where the idea of a romantic engagement of communities with people in various ways, we are not talking about optimality over there. We are talking about something else. We are talking about aporias, about the aporetic process of engaging with nature, ethical aporias of justice, where it is not clear as to what justice is. There are dilemmas, and there are aporias associated with that. So therefore, maybe that aporetic imagination and epistemic pluralization of nature is something that we need to approach in various ways, and that again is an invitation, is a dialogical invitation. No? The dialogue is diminishing in various ways, and dialogue diminishes by the articulation of securitization and self-interest. No? For the old magician, for example, who wanted to securitize his life and therefore decided, I'm going to keep my life inside a parrot's life, and so therefore nothing is going to happen to me. Nobody knows where my life is hidden. I have securitized myself against what happens. And the language of modern finance is exactly that language of securitization. There is an asset, you split that asset, hide that asset into multiple different assets, collateral debt obligations, swaps, portfolios, and so on and so forth. Does it prevent the financial crisis from occurring? All the mathematical modeling and securitization of assets and so on and so forth, many would argue that the financial crisis is a result of this, all this mathematical modeling and securitization and so on and so forth. That there is no magician who promises security actually delivers security, neither to himself, nor to the world around. It's a magic trick that always fails, miserably fails. The idea of securitization in various ways. What does it open us up to then? It opens us up to grief. Why not the discourse of grief, rather than the discourse of fear? Why not the discourse of vulnerability? Why not mourn the various ways in which we are no longer effective storytellers? No? And so therefore I can no longer tell a story to my young 4-year-old son. I have the capacity I am disabled in terms of being a storytelling person in various ways. It's storytelling disability. And that storytelling disability goes hand in hand with the commodification of culture, with say, Netflix taking over the storytelling capacities that ideally I should have had. I should have been able to tell stories to my son. But Netflix or YouTube or Tom and Jerry, Walt Disney says, oh no, meaning, number one, you're a very poor storyteller. As Walt Disney, I'm a fantastic storyteller. Give your son to me. And so therefore, I'll tell good stories in various ways. The moment you begin to lose the capacity to tell stories, what happens to politics? No, then in various ways, also closely connected with the idea of politics, as Professor Chaturvedi was pointing out, is the idea of ontology. And again, to return to Agamben, many issues today are not merely political issues, but also ontological issues. For example, can you think of being in all its forms devoid of sovereignty? And being which is more vulnerable, being which is more interconnected, being which recognizes multiple vulnerabilities without adding the calculus of risk to those vulnerabilities, a different vocabulary of being in various ways. If you can't think of being which is separate or more expansive from the narrow confines of sovereignty in various ways, how can you think of the state? How can you think of the world as moving beyond beyond the state of exception, where arbitrary sovereign interventions decide what's going to happen, with respect to our lives. And many of these arbitrary interventions are located, with respect to the fear of the migrant. And many political actions invoke the fear of the migrant to be able to normalize many decisions that are made in various ways. Again, to draw on many political thinkers who engage with the realm of fascism. That's fascism, or the politics of fear and hate, is very paradoxical. It relies on two ironical movements which take place together. Number one, there is a repulsion of the other, of the ethnic other. But at the same time, along with the repulsion, the ethnic other is also deemed to be a superhuman, magical creature in various ways. So there is a sense of awe also about the ethnic other in various ways. And so therefore we know that this is what happened in Germany. This is what happens, for example, the moment you say, that men belonging to a particular, ethnic community have superhuman powers, to be able to magnetize others and draw them into your fold and so on and so forth. And so therefore, it's a complex process. And perhaps then, when we think about climate and nature, all of these intersections, all of these possibilities, is what I think Professor Chaturvedi's fantastic encyclopedic lecture, almost in the vein of Umberto Eco's The Name of a Rose in various ways, where he's leading us into a world of references. And Professor Chaturvedi's lecture to me is exactly that, inviting us to explore each of these references and look at the way in which we are building then an encyclopedic world to be able to address the questions that are important to think about the way in which we live, largely, and immerse ourselves perhaps in a lyrical, poetic community which embraces love, grief, vulnerability, rather than work with contours of risk, securitization, fear, and of course, positivist interventions have their own merit in various ways, but also, look at a world beyond universal categories, maybe, and while still working with universal categories. If there can be cunning on the other side, why can't we have the same cunning, to be able to do the same thing? I think, therefore, all of us would like to listen to you. A teacher is always at the service of society, is a servant of society in various ways, and in that spirit of servantship, we would like to listen to you and understand what more can we as servants do to you do for you in various ways. And so thanks a lot, I mean to say, for this treasure of opening up multiple ways of thinking about this issue. And I'm sure that it opens up chords or resonates with people in very different ways. And so therefore, we are very eager to listen to you, and we'll make, and I'm sure that Professor Chaturvedi himself would want to respond or to see what more questions emerge as a result of the dialogue that we have. So we want to listen to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jagannathan. Now we'd like to open the floor for some questions and discussions. So we'll pass along the mic. Perhaps one mic can stay here and the other.
Please do introduce yourself. Yeah.
Hello, sir. Myself, Harshal Patil. I'm a PhD student of Mumbai University. I'm doing my PhD on environmental policies, actually. So my question is to you that, as we all know, that we need immediate action to mitigate a climate change right now. We already crossed all limits, and all the IPCC and the UN is also saying the same. So in 2017, in the Glasgow summit, Indian Prime Minister said that India will be the carbon neutral up to 2070. So I have two questions on that. The first one is that, is it the existing approach of Indian government, the policies are sustainable enough, or they have that capability or right approach that India will achieve that target up to 2070 or not? And even if we are achieve that target, is it we are going? Is it the right time limit 2070 to mitigate the climate change option? We know that we need a more aggressive approach to mitigate the climate change? That's two questions I have.
Should I respond one to one? With that? Okay.
Yeah, good evening, sir. My name is Purbi Kamble. I'm from Department of Civics and Politics, Mumbai University. So my question relates to the prior question itself, that in one of the slides, it was said that the fossil fuel production and consumption is increasing. And in one of the slides, you mentioned about India and China. So India and China being global consumers. And when we talk about climate change, we also talk about energy transition as the ethical course. And when we talk about energy transition, we talk about green energy. So how are India and China going on with the green energy goals? And what are their limitations as related to the prior question that in the Glasgow summit, both India and China have revealed that they cannot, they have to go on coal because there is realism associated with the fossil fuel industries. And my second question is that it was a very well presented slides that we need a normative approach on climate change. But once we get out of this room, we are going to be overwhelmed by the Chinese realism. And the Chinese are getting all the hydrocarbons from Russia at this present time in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That Russia is exporting many fossil fuels towards India and China. So how is this green energy ethics going to work? This is my second question. And are we going to overwhelm by China? Because everyone is going to export, everyone is going to import the cheaper fossil fuels now. And they are competing to import these fossil fuels.
Thank you. I think please allow me, Chair, to take these two questions first, because I might get. These are brilliant questions. If I start with the last one, I think both also overlap in the sense that there are these policy visions, right? Policy visions also come as a part of the larger climate diplomacy. Remember the last COP that we had, COP 27. And also remember that, by the way, the climate fund of $100 billion is still not implemented. I mean, that pledge is not met as yet. And there was a lot of discussion on loss and damage. So the point is that as two populous countries, India and China are under huge pressure when you talk about global climate diplomacy. Climate change action is also becoming a part of identity politics, which is understandable, whether it is green Walmart or countries which are ecologically responsible. They're talking about global citizenship. So I see nothing wrong with those visions. If we can have a carbon neutral, carbon free world by 2070, it's good to have that kind of a vision. Those visions are important. Now the point is that what are the pathways? How do we reach there where we want to be? We want to be there, because if we don't do that, then the evidence that comes from not just IPCC but what we are experiencing and observing ourselves and our bodies and our societies and cultures. Now that is not going to be easy. Firstly, because we still do not see a very graphic evidence, as I said, that the energy transitions are taking place. Because if you look at the energy mix of China, if I'm not terribly mistaken, it is still dominated overwhelmingly by coal, right? We also know that there was this argument of peaking, that you peak and then you decline. Now, sometimes we are missing out, I think, on a very important geopolitical factor here in this entire game of, or in this entire, how should I say, tug of war or whatever you call it, between the fossil fuel industry and the the alternative sources of energy. Don't forget that a lot of science has also taken place for climate denial. I mean, that is also science that has taken place. We also know that climate change, if it questions the primacy of certain energy exporting countries, oil exporting countries. It can also create a lot of space for nuclear energy. When you talk about nuclear energy and you do not talk about nuclear waste, that is another very important issue that has to be. So my point is that the moment you talk about climate change in terms of sectors, whether it is aviation sector or it is agriculture, you realize that the challenge is really daunting. You know, it requires interventions at multiple scales. It requires intervention at the local scale. It requires, and then there is another very complicated. You know, this is why I feel that two things. Number one, we need a movement, civil society movement, which could start from very simple changes in one's way of thinking and living, for example. At the same time, we need regional action and global action. Say, for example, in case of South Asia, I don't think you will be able to achieve these energy transitions towards clean in the absence of a sub-regional and regional cooperation. This is where organizations like BIMSTEC, for example, will have a very, very important role to play. And what if, take South Asia as an eco-geographical region, what if one country leads and creates a role model, but the other countries don't? Because again, that the disasters that will happen will realize no boundaries. So I think there are two things which we have to do as academics. The first thing is that we have to bring these meta-narratives at the macro scale to ground. We have to bring them to ground. And this we can do only with the help of case studies. So that is the reason that, you know, I always feel that coastal resilience, very good concept. We need resilient coastlines of Mumbai. But how can we journalize, as you said, you know, these are these universalizing narratives. You create these categories which are larger than life. So I think we keep the vision, but we also have to do a lot of hard thinking, bringing social sciences, natural sciences, engineering disciplines. You would also be aware of the fact that as we speak and talk about China's energy behavior, for example, or the Ukraine conflict, a good deal of investment is also going into what is called climate engineering, cloud engineering and climate engineering. That's another. We haven't talked about another elephant in the room, and that is carbon trading. Carbon trading that is taking place. Now, carbon trading is what? If you look at it from a critical social science perspective, it's more than business as usual. So I think my response to your very, very good questions is that I don't have the answers. I have more questions. Visions are appealing. We have to be there. How do we get there? At what scale do we need the interventions? It's not easy to decide. But how can you decide? How can you have policy interventions if you do not have research? For example, I still remember Dr. Manmohan Singh once very rightly pointed out in one of the addresses to Science Congress. He said, look, climate change can also create new dependencies. Because after all, when you talk about climate science or scientific knowledge, where is our research? Where is the research on our localities, our locations, our conditions? And the answer is that we still do not have. We are still, and I call it the tragedy of global knowledge commons as far as climate change is concerned. We want action, we want to act. In some cases, we do not have the political will. In some cases, we do not have the... Now, capacity building is another cliche, so to speak, that you do a workshop, you build the capacity of a community, and then hope for the best, without realizing that resilience of societies has been eroded over long centuries. And you can't make your ecosystems resilient if your communities do not have what you call, or they lack in social resilience or cultural resilience. So I think it's a huge, huge question. But we must ask, and we must continue to seek answers.
Yeah, Professor, thanks a lot for a lot of information and a lot of new terms which I came across today. But where you scientists are bringing down this complex information in the common man's domain, you are again like those big libraries and no action takers in the field. I'll tell you something. I belong to filmmaking. I decipher very big complex concepts into the downtrodden, that kind of language. For example, long ago when I was young, I narrated pasteurization to the common milk producer. What is pasteurization? He was very scared of pasteurization, and I learned that it's heating and cooling of milk. That is all pasteurization. So I think the communication deficit which is prevalent in the community today. Like once upon a time, it was that wildlife, how will it prosper? It will prosper in the sense that it will sustain. No animal will go extinct. When we make it a part of our lifestyle, today climate resilience or climate care is not a part of my daily life. So I feel that you will have to fill this up, this communication deficit. No channel today on the television talks about it unless there is something, there is that conference happening. Because one recently which happened, they said that world's presidents and prime ministers, they have extended their stay by 1 day because you could not come to a conclusion in that conference. So it was an item in the news channels that they have extended their stay as if it was a favor to the climate. It was favor to entire humanity. So I would recommend strongly that you fill up this communication deficit. Community will always follow you because you are privileged. And give them this knowledge in small little I would say small little capsules, so that your goal is achieved, the humanity's goal is achieved. Otherwise, it remains in big texts, big things, and it remains in the cassettes. Thanks.
Yes, I will respond to this later. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Hello sir, good evening. I am Vishal and I am pursuing Bachelor of Arts from Shalendra Education Society, and I am member of NSS, National Service Scheme. As you mentioned beaches and mangroves in your presentation, and we all know the importance of mangroves and beaches, how important they are. So I and my team go to the beaches and mangroves, we clean that area. But when we go later back on that place, what we see? We see the place is have more garbage than the before, in the comparison of before. So it is totally depend on the mentality of the people, that people have kind of mentality like, I want to do like, in simple terms if I will say, so I want to litter that place, I will. So is it totally depend on the mentality of the people that they want to litter that place? And my second question is, how we can prevent mangroves and beaches? Thank you so much.
Hello sir, good afternoon. Myself Avdut Borkar from research scholar from Amravati University. I have two questions regarding, first is from India-centric point of view. The thing is that in the politics of commitment and the claims of responsibility from majority world and minority world, where their perceptions about their terms like common but differentiated responsibilities, then emission trading, technology transfer, then the idea of polluter pays principle, where all this stands in a paradoxical situation where differences occur in developed world and developing world. So asking from India-centric point of view, India as a major country in terms of mitigating the impacts of climate change in global south, can India become the voice of global south in terms of mitigating the impacts of climate change? Because nowadays, in 2 years before, India has initiated the process, the action, International Solar Alliances, climate disaster resilient infrastructure. So can India become the voice of, can India possess the potential for becoming the voice of global south in terms of mitigating the impacts of climate change? And the second question is that, in the quest for establishing our national supremacy, primacy for national supremacy, national interest, does United Nations have, does United Nations creates efficiently, does United Nations is efficient enough and efficient enough or credible in terms of reducing the climate-driven conflict? Is United Nations really efficient and credible enough for that? Thank you.
I think all very important questions. Let me begin with the last one. Role of the United Nations. We know that IPCC process was initiated by UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP initiative. Now, role of UN is very intriguing because I remember there was a discussion, you would also recall, UN Security Council discussed climate change and a move which was not really appreciated by India, as far as I remember. Even China did not appreciate that. Because the fear was, number one, that if you talk about national, I mean, it's not that the national traditional security concerns are not there. But if you move away from human security paradigm towards the national security paradigm, you are taking a step towards securitization, and then you are getting closer in some cases to even militarization of climate change. As I showed you that slide, climate borders and new kinds of humanitarian interventions. And it can have huge implications for the entire idea of global peace and order, because there was a slide which I think I messed up. It was called climate borders, bordering, ordering, and othering. I was talking about these. I think it was there. So these three processes were there. So UN role, I would say, takes you to this discourse of global governance of climate change, about which my take is, yes, it is good to talk about global scale, even planetary scale, but the real scale to watch is the local scale. Is what you said, the problem of this garbage. It is not getting into your socio-spatial consciousness. And so there is, and I think communities like you, people like you, organizations like you will make a difference in that respect. How can India become a voice of, what is India? India is us. And that reminds you of what Mahatma Gandhi once said, be the change you want to see. Indian state makes a promise to the rest of the world on behalf of people of India, states of India. Now, it's not that Maharashtra doesn't have a climate action plan. All states have climate action plans. All states have their sustainable development goal. But the point is that if we leave the business of climate only to states, I don't think we are going to see light at the end of the tunnel. That doesn't mean states don't have an important role to play. But states are not the only actors who matter in addressing the challenge of climate change. And if we leave it to the state, we will never achieve the target of broadening and deepening the meaning of climate change. We will not have gender in it, we will not have social justice in it, we will not have environmental justice in it, we will not have urban slums in it, we will not have Dharavi in it. I personally feel that one way in which India can lead the way is by, and I'm saying it after a lot of thinking on this, internalizing the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Internalizing it. Because what we are telling the globe, or North, it's a common problem. Yes, we agree. But responsibility is not differentiated. And that debate is still going on, whether it is the per capita, or it is the total overall, pollution that you're causing. But one thing is very clear. And this is the politics of it. India can show the way forward, number one, as I said, by internalizing the principle and saying, we are not only telling the global community to have an affluence-based, subaltern approach to climate change, we are doing it ourselves. Which means we are addressing the question of poverty, we are addressing the question of hierarchies, we are addressing the question of vulnerability. We are creating a more egalitarian society. Not that we are our egalitarian society, but we want to reach 2070, that carbon neutral world, along with a more egalitarian, more just, more tolerant, and more diverse society, and as a society and as a collective. I think this is where G20, I'm very, very optimistic, because the other day at the IIM Calcutta, we had a session, and then we were, talking about this India's presidency and this that vision that India has kept for itself, which is very, very important. And I feel that if we can turn it into a movement, for example, the event here, if it can lead into a long-term research project at the center here, and then it can feed into other civil society organizations in Mumbai with the help of media, I think Mumbai can lead that movement as the financial capital, as a city which has shown its resilience in terms of all kinds of natural disasters. So that would be my response to your question. Coming to your, I think it's $1 billion question that you're asking. Many a time we feel, we in the sense that the community of researchers and community of scientists, we feel that it is still elite. It is sometimes a discourse remains very elitist because it does not relate itself to everyday struggles and experiences. This is where perspective from global South becomes important. This is where it becomes very important that we have to broaden and deepen. If we can bring it, if it can relate climate change to everyday struggle and survival of people of those who sleep on the pavements in Mumbai and Dharavi, dwellers of Dharavi. We are still, but the point is, what kind of language do you use? That is one problem. The second problem, I think, which is related to is the lack of understanding of the politics of knowledge production. This is another problem. Whose expertise counts or should count? Whose knowledge counts and should count? I can tell you that in this IPCC 6th assessment report, a friend of mine whom I had interviewed in 1996 when I was writing my Polar Regions book, a Sami gentleman from Finland, was at the forefront throughout the IPCC meetings of the indigenous people's voices. His argument was that, oh, you have science, great, fantastic, mitigation, adaptation, so on. But Samis and the Inuits, what we call tribals, First Nations, they have been a part of this change for long. They have knowledge. They have local knowledge systems and local knowledge practices. We don't count them as knowledge. So what qualifies as knowledge, or what should qualify as knowledge, should also be debated. Sometimes I feel that a painting or artwork, in fact I had some artwork, I deleted those slides. IPCC did what? They asked some painters and artists to depict climate change. I think industry, film industry, which is one of our great strength, can also be a site of taking this knowledge from the elite down to masses. For example, a movie which works on the intersections of environmentalism of the poor and conveys a message to the rest of the world that the greatest stakeholders, those who have the real stake in climate change, are the poorest of the poor. Because it is they who are going to have multiple exposures. Imagine a person, a woman, a Dalit woman, for example, having multiple exposures. She's exposed to the hierarchy, caste hierarchy. She's exposed to class hierarchy. Katrina showed racial hierarchy. On top of it, I was working on water crisis, the very important gender dimension, right? So I think gendering the climate change narratives and climate discourses will also make a difference and convey to the people that it is these people, their environmentalism, which should become the guiding force of the climate change narrative. If we will move bottom up, I think a lot of people in this country, even when they do not know the vocabulary of IPCC, adaptation, vulnerability, would know that there is something which is undermining their, what you said, ontological security. The very being is under threat. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor, for a very, very comprehensive lecture. I thought there should have been a workshop because there was so much that you had to say. My name is Zina Shaukat Ali, and I am the Director General of the Wisdom Foundation. I have a question, which comes from Greta Thunberg. The girl who speaks of climate change and who refused the Nobel Prize, that what kind of a world are you leaving for the young? So, my question is more, I feel a little more pessimistic because of course what you are saying that at the local level and the general level of education and understanding of how to go about, in climate change locally and but this entire power crisis, because what was Mr. Trump's reaction to her? That is what actually bothers me. What is happening in Ukraine today and what is Mr. Putin saying about using nuclear bombs? We don't know what he's going to do next. So when we are talking about climate change, and as you very right, very nicely pointed out that the United Nations itself is not united, and the great powers of the world who are really controlling us, they are the people who are in control of actually what is happening in the world in climate. How does one deal with that? Because at our local levels, yes, of course we look after things, but when it is coming down at that scale, the nuclear, threats, the fires that have been caught up and the fires that have burned, and what we see in the form of, as you have very extremely well pointed out, how the disasters are brought about and who's responsible. It is these people in power, who control so much. Now, how does one deal with that? Because, as you say, scientific knowledge, we cannot pervert. You have to be properly scientific and truly scientific to show that the world, what is happening to our globe, and we can bring an end to ourselves. How does one deal with that? I was just wondering.
Thank you, sir. It was our pleasure to hear you both here. And just like this gentleman said, we should put our questions or whatever, in very simple way. So I just have a very simple question to ask. The coastal road is coming up on a massive scale here in Mumbai, the coastal road. And so much of land is being, reclaimed for it. Huge land reclamation is on. So what will be the impact of this? And we also have a fear that will the oceans be crossing their limits with the shores, they will leave their shores, the oceans. So can you tell me on that? Thank you.
Both these questions are, again, very profound questions, and there is a set of, additional questions. To start with the pessimism, I think all of us who are in this, engaging with the climate story, have our moments of anxiety and pessimism. We do not see that collective behavioral change, in the right direction at the right time. And sometimes we also feel that where is the collective? Because we live in an era of excessive geopolitics today, as you said, excessive geopolitics. Everything is getting commodified and territorialized and also terrorized, so to speak. But I also feel that in this narrative, I do not want to use the word struggle, battle, war, but in this condition called climate change, Global South, there are pockets of global south and global north, but post-colonial, the kind of colonial exploitations that have taken place, the colonial loots that have taken place in Africa and Asia, we are still battling with those legacies. There's another politics here, which is that you would remember that 1950s, when I was studying my political science, we used to study W.W. Rostow's takeoff models of economic growth. And we blindly imitated those models. Professor Rajni Kothari, the great political scientist, at one stage talked about alternatives and then wrote an article called End of Alternatives. In fact, our book, which I showed you, From Himalaya to the Ocean, is dedicated to Professor Rajni Kothari. Precisely because he was the one who was telling us that the kind of development that you are engaged in will leave you nowhere. It's going to cause huge, whether you are building these bridges or China's Belt and Road. We're talking about one road here, and we are talking about some developments, very serious developments in Andaman Nicobar Islands, where are these new projects coming up. We forget that China's Belt and Road has huge environmental impacts and climate change implications. But we took those models. Now look at the politics. Atmosphere, we still do not talk about. We talk about outer space, we talk about cyberspace, we talk about terrestrial space, we talk about ocean space. We forget there is now this strategic space called atmosphere, which is not a infinite space. It is a finite space, which is already filled up. It is filled up, call it per capita emissions or whatever. It is, when Mr. Hansen gave that testimony before the US Congress, what was he saying? He was saying that there is a planetary emergency coming up, because at one stage the narrative was, let everybody follow our lifestyle. And therefore I like this. It's a very geopolitical and ethical statement. Climate change through lifestyles. Because the narrative was that America wants to remake the world in its own image. Everybody would be an American. One person, one car. To put it very bluntly. Same world, when they were being told that this finite space called the atmosphere, like a greenhouse, is almost filled up, then the point was, who has a right to that space? We have in this part of the world, revolution of rising expectations, where everybody wants to be a part of middle class. Now, a middle class, which is an indicator of your rise, is also an indicator, is also the reason for global sea level rise. Rising Asia means more middle classes. Rising India means more middle classes. So the message from the global north comes, not that there's no climate denial here, climate change denial, but the politics of it, stop. Right. Don't develop the way we are developed, because if you develop, that's why my slide, can billions develop the way in which millions have developed? No. And the millions would not allow the billions to develop. Hence the reluctance for technology transfers, $100 billion fund is still, is not there. So then the point is, even if we use, I think we should do that, broaden and deepen climate change, look at it in intersections. I think we will have to do something for our own sake, for the sake of our children and grandchildren, to ensure. Another point which, if please permit me, in our book we have argued climate terror. We have said, we are bothered about the death of future citizens, whether they are from north or they are from south. We are deeply bothered, we are deeply concerned. Intergenerational equity is important, but what about those who are dying now? The lungs of the planet Earth are fine. Don't cut Amazonian forests because they are the lungs of the planet Earth. Fine. But what about the lungs of the poor who are getting exposed to the pollution in Delhi and losing their lives? So the death of today also matters, along with the death of tomorrow. So like all our you are a grandmother, my wife is sitting here. To be very, now I worry, also as a climate science, social scientist, I also worry about my granddaughter who is 4 years old and then other grandchildren. So I think this generation, which is now a passing generation, in dialogue with the young generation and the generation that is being born, even if for its own self-interest, will have to turn this into an awareness campaigns social movements, and new way of imagining ourselves, new ways of rethinking development. Even if we do it for our own sake, it will be worth its while to go to the people of Mumbai and say, please do not throw the litter, because it's going to come back to you into your intestines. This contamination is not going to stay outside your body. It is going to be inside you. This pollution is going to be inside you. So I fully agree with you. There are moments of pessimism, but then we also sometimes say that hope is the only weapon of the weak. Right? And we are on the periphery. Even in terms of knowledge production, I can tell you that scholars from the global south are still on the periphery, because we have not created our own centers of knowledge production. And that is something we'll have to do. And this will remain, ma'am. We have seen this in climate change narratives, these trade-offs. These trade-offs are, whose security matters. Today, in order to have connectivity projects, if we destroy ecology, it's going to come back to us. If not today, then tomorrow. So I think these trade-offs will have to be addressed. This is where I think role of NGOs, role of civil societies, role of academics and scholars, so that we do something for national interest, but enlighten national interest, realizing that we have to make choices. So it's a huge question, very important questions, but I think we continue to debate them and try to seek answers. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Good evening all. On behalf of Yashwantrao Chavan Center, I extend my vote of thanks to today's speaker, Honorable Professor Chaturvedi, who enlightened us on such kind of topic which is very much necessary for this generation and coming generation. Also, I am very much thankful to our chairperson who presiding and gave remark on particular topic. Also, I am very much thankful to all who attended this program, and I think that this topic we continue with our actions as a role of NGO, role of individual person. Once again, I am thank you to one and all. I would like to request you to stand up for the national anthem.
शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय